Oh dear. It seems like the afterglow of Max Verstappen winning the 2024 championship has now already gone. And why 2025 will be a really critical year if they want to keep Max through 2028. They cannot ignore him again. And this revelation of what I'm about to share with you actually gives Checo even more slack because, hey, I guess they were being fair after all, because they chose not to listen to Max either. So this revelation from the team's technical director explains a fair bit in regards to what we saw at the Hungarian Grand Prix, where Max Verstappen flew off the handle at the team's inability to provide a high downforce package for the RB20, which could give him a chance at a victory, and it could barely contend for even the top 5. So it's kind of like what Sergio Pérez experienced back in 2023. That was admitted by the team principal Christian Horner himself, that his own concerns were not actually taken heed of for the sake of, well, I see what the problem is, Checo. Max won the Spanish Grand Prix. I think it's fair to say that you just gotta give this current car a go. Basically, it's the team avoiding to make changes because they see no reason to rock the boat or anything like that. And it really goes to show that Red Bull is not all that great when things are going really well for them and everything is smooth. Throwing in a little bit of jeopardy, they really sing. But anyway, let's break this down, what Pierre Vacher had to say. Just so that means you're not waiting around so I can actually get to the point here. So here's the quote. Ahem. I think we did see it, the balance problems. Just the car was fast and so we didn't want to change it dramatically. When we went back to Europe and were challenged more by McLaren, it became more and more clear that this was one of our biggest problems, to go faster. Now, on the surface, you might be thinking, is that really it? Well, this goes on to explain a lot about why Max became so vociferous and angry and frustrated, and that's why ultimately everyone paid attention to that, and not the fact that simply Red Bull did not actually listen in time. Because of what Max had to say in his honest comments, the media decided not to pay attention to the fact that Red Bull simply were being overconfident and cocky, and instead just merely paint Verstappen as Mad Max all over again, and that he hadn't learned a single thing, and he was no longer mature, and all that stuff. And in a way you could argue, Red Bull sort of ran with it. It was almost a means of deflection. So that means Red Bull can find something out in the quiet and, you know, basically using the Dutchman as some sort of just like, oh, look over there! Is that really how Max wants to be treated? No wonder Jos Verstappen won't shut up. But then again, I kind of understand why Red Bull are being really cautious, because throughout 2024, we saw exactly the same thing happen with Aston Martin and Ferrari when they decided to change things in order to gain some performance, and it backfired hard. And even Red Bull saw it with Racing Bulls. They did that thing in Imola. They fell off the pace. Pierre Vacher didn't want that happening to Red Bull Racing, and then Max would have been even madder. But there is nothing worse than an angry Verstappen who is basically not being listened to. I think it's very, very clear. And alluding to the issues of Imola, Red Bull suffered them too, with the beginning of the balance issues that Verstappen reported on very, very early. That any major tinkering they probably worried with the RB20 suspension and handling might see the car veer off course even more. And the team no longer had the oversight of Adrian Newey to even just nudge them back toward what worked with the RB18. Which is exactly what Max attempted to do himself with that private test of theirs at the Imola circuit, which he really embedded himself in to find some kind of solution to said balance problem. Oh, and by the way, for all of the conspiracy theorists thinking that the FIA and Formula 1 have got it in for Max, after that test, the FIA and F1 changed the rules. All active racers can only take part in these TPC cars, that is cars 2 years or older, up to a distance of 1,000 kilometers over the course of a season. Something which Ferrari will use supposedly before 2025 even begins, so that Lewis Hamilton can start the season as prepared as he can be with the Scuderia. In any case, I don't think you need me to tell you that over the course of 2024, Pierre Vacher and his team have been very, very keen to downplay the loss of Adrian Newey, that they don't need him anymore, and that actually he wasn't all that important. Even Christian Horner was very keen to say that, oh, Adrian wasn't really that important toward the end of it. He barely attended meetings. He was really on his way out. He was focusing on the hypercar, the RB17, and also his boat. Yeah, he was spreading himself way too thin. He didn't really matter, whereas clearly he did matter, because I remember also the comment that Vacher made that Newey's presence, even though it was small, was invaluable. Even if he was just an extra pair of eyes near the end of his time with the team, it was something. However, despite the Red Bull team wishing to be seen as the renegades of F1 and the bad boys of the sport, they are relatively conservative when it comes to their desire to maintain the status quo at present in this current era, when evolving the RB18 into the 19, which is now taken up home at the team's base in Milton Keynes, and their now famous display of classic Red Bull cars at MK7. Now, whilst the performance over the course of a whole season cannot be denied, and it deserves to be called the most competitive and strongest Formula One car in the entire sport's history, it too had its fair share of problems. Of course, the things I mentioned with Checo, his inability to get on top of the car, whereas Max Verstappen was absolutely flying, the team focusing on him, obviously, because he went on to win 10 Grand Prix in a row. Granted, Red Bull were transparent about this notion that they wouldn't do so well in Marina Bay, preparing the wider world for the team to not be as strong there, but given the performance of the car at other circuits, the F1 world really didn't take this seriously, and no one thought it was the beginning of the end of the team, really. Because realistically, anyone thinking it was the beginning of the end and this was a return to glory for Ferrari, no, that was mainly born out of hope, because Max then went on to win 19 Grand Prix that year out of 22. That's wild still. And then proceeded to dominate 4 of the first 5 races of the following year. But then here we are, at the beginning of 2025. No one is quite sure as to how good the RB21 will be, and whether or not it'll be good enough to give Max Verstappen his 5th consecutive title. That level of uncertainty has been relatively absent during the ground effect era of F1 for Red Bull, and even though the team has done really well in trying to play down the disruption in terms of the hierarchy within the senior management that has been around for pretty much since 2006, because you've got the departure of Adrian Newey, you've got the departure in 2023 of their lead engineer Rob Marshall, then their sporting director Jonathan Wheatley, who was instrumental in Abu Dhabi 2021, he's going off to Audi. The team has been very keen to say, things won't change, we'll be fine, people will step up to the plate and make sure that we have some continuity. They learnt well under these senior superiors, and whilst I do commend Red Bull for actually getting its act together toward the end of the year, so that means they could still provide Max a car that could sustain a 4th world title, there are still some rumblings for their long-term future, which I feel haven't quite gone away. The fact of the matter is that partly the reason why headlines still swirl around to this day regarding the future of Max Verstappen is because of the balance issue not being taken seriously as soon as their lead driver brought it to light. Well, they did have to worry about it. The improvements gained of McLaren in Miami turned out not to be a bit of a fluke and circuit-specific, because that is something that people have been talking about throughout the course of 2024. Circuit-specific performance, as in, oh, well, they did well there. Doesn't necessarily mean they'll do well there. Then McLaren in 2024 proved to actually be effective to some extent at pretty much all the circuits, which is now making Red Bull think, oh, we've actually got ourselves a really serious competitor here. Oh, they were very much given a little bit of breathing space for the fact that McLaren were really learning on the fly, that they made plenty of mistakes. By all accounts, McLaren should have dominated 2024, but as we all know, they didn't. And then Ferrari got their act together, even with the mid-season wobble. And then even Mercedes started to win races again. But even though the W15 lacked outright pace, it was a little more agreeable than the previous 2 iterations for both drivers. In fact, Max Verstappen bashing his head against the wall with the Red Bull engineers with the RB20 reminds me of something that happened not all that long ago to another multiple world champion. Doesn't this seem really, really familiar? And I'm having to get the foam of doubt for this one. Is this really something similar to what Lewis Hamilton experienced with the W13 and its evolution into the W14, what we saw at the beginning of 2023? This feels like almost a carbon copy, and now Max is feeling what Lewis felt. And we all know what happened to Lewis and why he's no longer at Mercedes. Because logically, for the W14, you would listen to the feedback from your lead driver who provided you so many world titles to ensure that they were able to perform at the best of their ability, since you're obviously paying him a lot to perform, and if you're not giving him the car to do it, then you got a problem. But then 2022 proved to be a very confusing year for the team, because the W13 had a lack of stability, downforce, and of course it had the porpoising issue. The team's other driver, George Russell, though, was a lot more consistent, which made things all the more difficult to fathom, securing multiple top 5 finishes in the first half of the year, and then he got that win in Brazil, which Toto has now admitted was a bit of a red herring. As a result, the team clung on to hope that the concept that they stuck with, the zero pods and as well as other things, had some legs. And then, of course, we saw what happened after Bahrain 2023. That open letter to the Mercedes fans, and then Lewis Hamilton began his warpath. We saw him constantly berating the team for not listening to his feedback over the winter, and then he made sure that he was even more active in the W15's development. He was there at the wind tunnel, in the simulator, And that is something because Lewis really hates the simulator, to ensure that everything he said about that car was actually implemented into that car. And probably what made him feel a little bit more confident is that James Allison was returned to active duty because he was one of the lead developers of Lewis Hamilton's successive cars from 2017 onwards. Even then, that was still too little too late. Mercedes really fell off the pace. They were not competitive in terms of the championship. And now Lewis is off at Ferrari. And speaking of Ferrari, I think they are going to be lapping all of this discord up to the extreme. Because come off it, they've been taking notes in the wake of the drama surrounding the W14 and Lewis's protestations, pouring all of their research into the 677 project, which has already passed the FIA crash test, so that's helpful, and now has the oversight of Mercedes man Loic Serra working on the car's suspension geometry and how the car will utilise its tyres to prevent them from overheating over a single lap, something of which really hampered the W15's potential and why Lewis Hamilton would always fall down in qualifying. So with that, you could argue that in the midst of Mercedes and Red Bull's struggles with their respective car developments and the realisation that at some point they chose not to pay mind to their lead drivers' concerns, that the biggest beneficiaries of all of this are McLaren and Ferrari. As a result of all of this complacency and a desire to trust the engineers over their drivers, the people who actually race the car, these two old school teams are now at a point where they have caught up and now surpassed the two teams that effectively dominated the 2010s. Ferrari will reap the rewards of the Mercedes research into Hamilton's overheating maladies and problems with the rear of the car, whereas McLaren will give him plenty of time to catch up to Red Bull and give Norris some semblance of a shot at the 2024 world title. Now, I know that many people will be keen to say that, oh, come off it, Lando's a bottler. He couldn't challenge Max seriously, and even though Lando admits that, yeah, he was not fully prepared to take on Verstappen, the fact of the matter is that there were points where Lando and Max could fight on track. Having these experiences is much better than not having these experiences at all. As I mentioned earlier, McLaren made plenty of logistical and strategical mistakes over the course of 2024. But the fact is, they've made them, they've learned from them, and Lando is taking this on board as well, because the back end of 2024, Lando seemed much more calm, assured. That pressure of 2024 now gone, he seems like a changed man. Because of the struggles which Red Bull suffered with during the second half of the season especially, it's provided McLaren a chance to regain the mindset of a World Championship outfit, which they have not had for many, many years now. Shake off the errors ahead of what will be an extremely competitive 2025 campaign. Ferrari will not just benefit from what I mentioned earlier regarding having a car which will really give Lewis Hamilton a leg up from day one, but they'll also benefit from the fact they now have a rejuvenated Charles Leclerc, who arguably has had his best season in Formula One ever. Not only was he able to win his home race in Monaco, finally, win again the race in Monza, and in a really spectacular fashion to boot, he and the team have put away to bed the ever-present and ever-mocked strategical blunders that the team have become infamously known for. They're beginning to fade into the background in history, albeit they are going down swinging from time to time. Ferrari took the fight to McLaren for the constructors all the way down to the final lap of the final race. Sainz and Leclerc gave it everything. They did all they could to try and beat McLaren, but ultimately they came up a bit short by only 14 points. Going from that to where they were in 2020, that is a huge tour de force and achievement. That is something they can be proud of. As a result, I think McLaren and Ferrari are completely ready to take on Red Bull over the course of the entirety of 2025. And Mercedes are not that far behind. Sure, the odds are likely that they might finish fourth in the constructors again, but I feel like they will be much closer to the likes of Red Bull, and of course bag themselves a fair few wins to boot. Alright, I can probably suspect that amongst some of you that I'm laying into Red Bull too much, so there are some things I should be really giving them credit for. I will commend the team in managing to hold it together well enough to ensure that Max had the car under him to be able to fend off the likes of Lando Norris and McLaren when it mattered most, because the Brazilian Grand Prix, that was a masterstroke, giving Max yet another legendary drive that people will be talking about for years to come. Easily outclassing, in my opinion, his drive there in 2016. Because ultimately, Red Bull managed to survive. I think with many other teams, their team principal being caught in controversy, and many of its senior staff leaving very, very quickly and very successfully, could easily bring many teams in the past in Formula One all the way down to the brink of collapse. It managed to stick the landing, albeit having plenty of wobbles around the way. So, hey, Christian Horner, he managed to just keep it together. He managed to survive, even though he made plenty of blunders as well. His attempt to try and remotivate Checo completely failed, and it completely ruined the chance of maybe securing the services of Carlos Sainz, and now Liam Lawson is being thrust into the lion's den. I hope he does well, but I do feel like it's all to play for, and I think even Horner knows it, saying that it's down to them ultimately at all costs to protect Lawson from whatever may come his way. They came away from 2024 with a world championship to their name. Even if it wasn't the team title, it was something. They also managed to work through the noise once Max's own noise was becoming too loud to ignore after Hungary, to produce an RB20 which could work for him when it came down to it, as long as they had enough time to find the sweet spot, because in the last few races it was very clear to see that in FP1 the car was nowhere, but once they found the setup, they managed to find something. Maybe that was a necessary evil. Perhaps they needed to be this drastic to put all of their eggs in one basket to produce an RB21, which will work with Max from the get-go, and they would also hope that Lawson can maybe keep up to some extent. There'll be far less pressure than there was for Checo, and that means they can then develop from there to be able to improve the development window, the sweet spot, to make it a little bit wider and a little bit more versatile at many other circuits. That is something that they really need to focus on. But hey, that's something that they have a car which does have pace, but they need to make sure that the spectrum is broader. They got there in the end, but I personally think that all of this could have been avoided had they simply just listened to Sergio back in 2023. It's now come to roost, because Sergio's own concerns with the RB19 were evident from the 2023 Spanish Grand Prix. And in 2024, the same thing happened again with Checo, and now, as we have seen, with Max as well. The RB20 was there. It seemed to work, and they were getting 1-2 finishes all the time. 4 out of the 5 races, they were right up there, Max taking wins. It was looking like it was going to repeat itself. If the drivers have concerns, then there's no need to do any hasty changes right there. We'll figure something out, and besides, the competitors, Ferrari, McLaren, Aston Martin really fell off, Mercedes were nowhere, McLaren were okay, Ferrari looked like the closest challenger, but even then, there was still some ways to go, because even though Carlos Sainz won Australia, that was mainly down to the fact that Max Verstappen had that brake issue, so that means he wasn't even in contention, and then Sergio Pérez had floor damage, which then heated his own progress as well. There were explainable reasons to just bash that concern away. But after Imola, after McLaren got within half a second of taking that win, then there was something that they really needed to address, but they simply didn't. As we saw, McLaren's new wind tunnel came online, Red Bull still had their archaic Cold War era one, which meant that, yes, Red Bull got caught with their pants down. In my mind, Red Bull thrives under pressure, but struggles with complacency. Overconfidence in their pace allowed rivals like McLaren and Ferrari to close the gap, forcing the team to scramble for solutions mid-season. As a result, it has had multiple negative consequences. Now, even though Max Verstappen has remained loyal and he still trusts in the process ultimately to provide him a car which can give him the chance of a world title, which we have seen at the back end of 2024 because he's been able to win races again, Brazil, that was remarkable. I bet you that if he had not had a chance to win that race and Lando was able to get within one race of the World Championship, then maybe his loyalty might have been tested even more because, as Lewis Hamilton said back in his McLaren days, loyalty has its limits, and I think Max was about to prove that, but then Brazil happened, and then Red Bull got some breathing space, thankfully. Maybe the RB21 might be better, but one thing is for sure. Red Bull will not be going into 2025 as the outright favourites. It's going to be all to play for. We saw throughout the middle of 2024 the team scrambling around rapidly to find a solution on their own, without the man who led them to domination in the 2010s and the beginnings of the 2020s. Not only that, but even when they did get back on track and focus on Verstappen, it came at the cost of Sergio Pérez, and that meant the Mexican had to hustle more than ever to get anywhere close to being competitive. And when you couple that with all of the sports counselling that Sergio was getting, and that meant he felt like he was completely invincible, and he was able to, admittedly successfully, bash off the criticism that really affected him in 2023, especially coming from Dr. Marco, it made Checo feel unstoppable and untouchable, which meant that he was able to push harder, try harder, and therefore crash harder. As we all know, he was sustaining a lot of damage, wrecking his cars, increasing the repair bill, meaning that it was actually troubling the Williams contingent, meaning that takes up time, resources, money, and time in developing and fixing the issues of the RB20 and the RB21, and therefore it's going to have some issues impacting the RB22. So the legacy of Checo's annus horribilis, which has now seen him being ejected from the sport in a really undignified manner, it's going to be really affecting this team for many years to come. Yes, the RB22 of 2026 is going to be crucial for the team and where it's going to be headed into the second half of this decade. Will the team buck its ideas up and provide an RB18-like machine and actually read the regulations right? Or will it be more like an RB10, a car which falls back from the front and proves to be so unreliable and slow that it forces its lead driver to make moves elsewhere? Yes, I know what you're going to say about the RB10, that Renault was mainly responsible for why it was so slow and unreliable. Adrian Newey did all he could with the design of the car, but ultimately it came up short because it could barely compete. But the fact remains, though, is that Red Bull are going to be going into that season with their own Red Bull powertrains division, and even Christian Horner admits that it's going to be a really, really tall mountain to climb to be able to be competitive from day one, because it's practically impossible for a brand new power unit supplier, these days especially, to be able to hit the ground running and have an engine that will trounce everybody. So in a manner of speaking, Christian is experiencing a similar situation to what Mercedes went through in 2022. In not taking their lead driver seriously when expressing their negative feedback regarding their car. And in a way, I felt like Mercedes deserved this bad karma, because look back to 2021. Verstappen and Hamilton were the class of the field. In the same car, they were 30, 40, 50 seconds ahead of their teammates. The rest of the field completely nowhere. They made the difference in those cars, the W12 and the RB16B. Their feedback is important, more important than anybody else. They know how to drive a car. Their influence and involvement as to the development of a particular machine and the team is effectively absolute at this point. However, in their own unique ways, Mercedes and Red Bull chose not to heat these two important men and multiple world champions at this point, and it's now coming home big time for the likes of the Milton Keynes team, because now they've got a situation where Max Verstappen is on the back foot for 2025, and now his dad is going to be constantly saying throughout the entire season to Christian, "Hey, you guys deserve this! You suck!" Only with a Dutch accent. Anyway, by sticking out to the end of this video, I can clearly sense that you like a little bit of mayhem in your life. So to find out more why I think there could be even more mayhem to be had next year, further down the grid with all of these new rookies, watch this video next, straight after this one.